Waitress told him, "My mother always spoke of you." Millionaire couldn't hold back tears. "Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today?" The rain hammered against the windows of the small diner on Highway 9, each droplet creating rivulets that distorted the neon lights outside. Theodore Richardson sat in the corner booth, his expensive Italian leather shoes slightly dampened from his hurried entrance, his tailored charcoal suit incongruous among the vinyl seats and chipped formica tables. At 62, Theodore commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, his investment empire worth over $2 billion. Yet tonight he felt strangely vulnerable, almost lost. The decision to drive this forgotten stretch of highway had been impulsive, born from a restlessness that had plagued him for months since his latest acquisition had closed. Success, it seemed, had become a hollow echo in the cathedral of his achievements. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, save for a trucker hunched over coffee at the counter and an elderly man reading a newspaper in the opposite corner. The fluorescent lights buzzed intermittently, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the wear and tear of a place that had seen better decades. Theodore studied the laminated menu with its faded photographs of hamburgers and pie, wondering what impulse had driven him here, instead of to the 5-star restaurant his driver had originally suggested. Perhaps it was the memory that had surfaced during his morning meditation, a fragment of his childhood when such places had represented adventure rather than a step down from his usual establishments. A young woman approached his table, her uniform clean but showing signs of many washings, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She couldn't have been more than 25, Theodore estimated, with tired eyes that spoke of long shifts and early mornings. Her name tag read Sarah, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded attention despite her humble circumstances. When she looked at him, Theodore noticed something flicker across her features, a moment of recognition that passed so quickly he wondered if he had imagined it. "Good evening, sir. What can I get you tonight?" Her voice carried a slight tremor, and Theodore found himself studying her face more carefully. There was something familiar in the curve of her jaw, the way she tilted her head slightly when waiting for his response. He ordered coffee and a piece of apple pie, hardly registering his own words as he tried to place where he might have encountered this young woman before. The feeling nagged at him, like a name on the tip of his tongue that refused to surface. Theodore Richardson had not always been a billionaire. 50 years earlier, he had been Tommy Richardson, a scrawny 12-year-old from the wrong side of Pittsburgh whose single mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads. Margaret Richardson had been a force of nature despite her diminutive stature, standing barely 5 feet tall, but possessing a will that could move mountains. She cleaned offices at night, took in laundry during the day, and somehow found time to volunteer at the community center, teaching other struggling mothers how to stretch their food budgets and navigate the welfare system. Those early years had shaped Theodore in ways that his Harvard MBA and subsequent success could never erase. He remembered the smell of their tiny apartment, a mixture of industrial cleaning supplies that clung to his mother's clothes, and the perpetual aroma of beans and rice that formed the foundation of most of their meals. He remembered the way she would count and recount the bills on the kitchen table, moving small piles of crumpled dollar bills and coins like pieces in some desperate chess game against poverty. Most vividly, he remembered her hands, red and raw from constant work, yet infinitely gentle when she would brush his hair back from his forehead and tell him that someday, if he studied hard and never gave up, he could be anything he wanted to be. The scholarship to boarding school at 14 had been both salvation and exile. Theodore had thrown himself into his studies with the fervor of a convert, determined to prove worthy of his mother's sacrifices. He excelled in mathematics and economics, discovering an intuitive understanding of market forces that his professors found remarkable. By 18, he had earned a full scholarship to Harvard, and by 25, he had started his first investment firm with money borrowed against his mother's house. The guilt of that decision still haunted him, the memory of signing papers that put her small home at risk, while she smiled proudly and insisted she believed in his dreams. Success had come quickly, almost suspiciously so. Theodore possessed an uncanny ability to spot trends before they materialized, to identify companies on the verge of breakthrough innovations, to navigate the complex psychology of market sentiment. Within a decade, he had multiplied his initial investment 100-fold. Within 2 decades, he was featured on magazine covers as one of the most successful investors of his generation. With each milestone, each acquisition, each zero added to his net worth, he had promised himself that he would return to his roots, that he would help people like his mother, like the person he used to be. Yet somehow those promises had been postponed, deferred, rationalized away by the demands of managing an ever-growing empire. His mother had died 8 years ago, having lived to see him achieve everything she had dreamed of for him. Yet he sometimes wondered if she had died still waiting for him to remember where he came from. The funeral had been attended by senators and CEOs, but Theodore had felt utterly alone, standing beside the casket of the woman who had given him everything, wondering when he had last truly talked to her about something other than his business achievements. Sarah returned with his coffee and pie, setting them down with practiced efficiency. As she turned to leave, Theodore found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to do so. "Excuse me, Sarah. This might sound strange, but have we met before? There's something familiar about you." The words hung in the air between them, and Theodore immediately regretted his impulsiveness. She was probably accustomed to wealthy older men making inappropriate advances, and he had just added himself to that unwelcome category. But instead of the polite deflection he expected, Sarah's eyes widened with something that looked like shock. She glanced around the nearly empty diner, then back at him with an intensity that made Theodore suddenly very aware of his heartbeat. "Mr. Richardson," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You probably don't remember me. I'm Sarah Collins now, but I used to be Sarah Martinez. My mother was Elena Martinez." The name hit Theodore like a physical blow, catapulting him back 30 years to a small apartment building in a rough neighborhood where he had gone to collect a debt. Elena Martinez had been a tenant in a building he had purchased as part of his first major real estate acquisition, a property he had planned to renovate and convert to condominiums. She had been behind on rent, 6 months pregnant, and recently abandoned by her boyfriend, working as a seamstress for barely minimum wage while trying to care for her ailing mother. Theodore remembered that day with crystalline clarity because it had been the first time his business success had put him face to face with the kind of desperation he thought he had left behind. Elena had answered the door with swollen eyes and a defiant tilt to her chin, ready to plead for more time while simultaneously preparing to fight for her right to stay in the only home she could afford. She had been perhaps 19 years old, with work-roughened hands and a courage that reminded Theodore painfully of his own mother at that age. The conversation that followed had lasted 3 hours and had changed the trajectory of both their lives. Elena had not begged, had not made excuses, had simply laid out her circumstances with brutal honesty and asked for a chance to prove she could catch up on her payments. Theodore had found himself not just granting her request, but arranging for her to receive job training through a program his company funded, helping her find better-paying work, and eventually hiring her as a translator for his growing number of Hispanic clients. "Elena," Theodore whispered now, the coffee cooling forgotten in his hands. "Your mother was Elena Martinez. She worked for my company for, 15 years? The memories flooded back with startling vividness. Elena's fierce intelligence as she navigated complex business negotiations, translating not just language, but cultural nuances that had saved Theodore millions in international deals. Her quiet dignity as she raised Sarah alone, refusing Theodore's offers of additional help beyond what she had earned. Her pride the day she had graduated from night school with a business degree, tears streaming down her face as she thanked Theodore for believing in her when no one else would. Sarah nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. 17 years, actually. She worked for you until she got sick. Lung cancer. She died 3 years ago. The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for a very long time. She talked about you all the time, especially near the end. She said you saved our lives, that you were the only person who ever saw her as more than just another poor Hispanic girl looking for a handout. Theodore felt something crumble inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart to protect himself from exactly this kind of pain. Elena had been more than an employee. She had been a reminder of his better angels, a connection to the person he used to be before success had insulated him from the struggles of ordinary people. When she had first gotten sick, he had made sure her medical bills were covered, had arranged for the best possible care. But he had done it through intermediaries, through the human resources department, maintaining the professional distance he thought appropriate. "I should have been there," Theodore said, his voice rough with emotion. "For the funeral, I mean. I should have been there for you both." The admission hung between them like a confession, and Theodore realized that Sarah's presence here, serving coffee and pie in a roadside diner, represented a failure on his part that went beyond mere professional responsibility. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara slightly. "She wouldn't have expected that, Mr. Richardson. She always said you had already done more than enough, that we couldn't ask for anything more from you." She paused, looking around the diner again. But she did say something else toward the end. "She made me promise that if I ever saw you again, I would tell you something." Theodore leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the distance, he could hear the trucker calling for more coffee, the ordinary sounds of life continuing while his world shifted on its axis. "What did she want you to tell me?" "She said to tell you that you had forgotten who you really were, but that it wasn't too late to remember. She said the money and the success were fine, but that the Tommy Richardson she knew, the one who saw her as a person worth investing in, that person was still inside you somewhere. She was worried you had lost him in all the boardrooms and business deals." The words hit Theodore with the force of prophetic judgment, laying bare truths he had spent decades avoiding. Elena had seen through his transformation, had recognized that somewhere between Tommy and Theodore, between the scholarship boy and the billionaire, he had lost something essential about himself. The realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure, forcing him to confront the growing emptiness that no amount of success had been able to fill. "What are you doing here, Sarah? Working in a place like this?" Theodore asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah was intelligent like her mother, but intelligence alone was not enough to overcome the systemic barriers that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty. Without connections, without capital, even the most talented individuals could find themselves struggling to survive in an economy that rewarded privilege as much as merit. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "The same thing a lot of people are doing, Mr. Richardson, working 3 jobs to try to pay off my mother's medical bills and keep up with my own student loans. I graduated with a degree in social work 2 years ago, but the jobs in my field don't pay enough to cover my expenses. So I work here nights, clean offices during the day, and do freelance translation work on weekends. It's not the life my mother dreamed for me, but it's honest work." The casual way she described her circumstances, the matter-of-fact acceptance of a situation that would have been unthinkable for someone of Theodore's social circle, struck him as both admirable and tragic. Sarah possessed her mother's dignity, but she was trapped by circumstances that her intelligence and work ethic alone could not overcome. More troubling still was the recognition that Theodore had the power to change her situation with a simple phone call. Yet he had been oblivious to her struggle while she had been working less than 2 hours from his corporate headquarters. "Sarah, why didn't you contact me after your mother died? You must have known I would want to help, would want to make sure you were all right." Even as he asked the question, Theodore knew the answer. Pride. The same fierce independence that had defined Elena had been passed down to her daughter. Sarah would no more ask for help than her mother would have accepted charity. "Mom made me promise not to," Sarah said simply. "She said you had already given us more than we had any right to expect, and that my life was my responsibility, not yours. She said the only thing worse than asking for help you didn't deserve was asking for help you didn't need, and that if I was really her daughter, I would find a way to make it on my own." Theodore closed his eyes, seeing Elena's face as clearly as if she were sitting across from him. She would have said exactly that, would have viewed any request for additional assistance as a betrayal of the self-reliance she had fought so hard to maintain. It was a perspective born from dignity and shaped by experience, the world-view of someone who had learned that independence was often the only protection against disappointment. But there were other forces at work in Sarah's current circumstances, systems and structures that Theodore was only beginning to understand despite his decades in business. The medical debt that had accumulated during Elena's illness, the student loans that saddled young people with decades of financial obligation, the job market that undervalued social work while richly rewarding financial manipulation. These were not personal failings, but systemic problems that required systemic solutions. "Tell me about your work," Theodore said, leaning back in the booth. "The social work, I mean. What kind of work were you hoping to do?" It was a question born from genuine curiosity, rather than polite conversation, and Sarah's face immediately brightened with passion that transformed her tired features into something radiant. "I wanted to work with families like ours used to be," she said, her voice gaining strength and conviction. "Single mothers trying to navigate the system, kids who are smart but don't have access to the resources they need, people who are working hard but can't seem to get ahead, no matter what they do. I wrote my senior thesis on innovative approaches to breaking cycles of poverty, focusing on comprehensive support systems rather than piecemeal assistance programs." As Sarah talked, Theodore found himself genuinely impressed by her insights and analysis. She had clearly inherited her mother's intelligence, but her formal education had given her theoretical frameworks to understand problems that Elena had known only through lived experience. Sarah understood poverty not just as a personal challenge to be overcome, but as a complex social phenomenon that required sophisticated interventions. "The problem," Sarah continued, warming to her subject, "is that most social service organizations are so overwhelmed and underfunded that they can only address immediate crises. They can help someone avoid eviction this month or find emergency food assistance, but they don't have the resources to address the underlying factors that created the crisis in the first place. It's like putting band-aids on a wound that needs surgery." Theodore nodded, recognizing the frustration of someone who could see solutions but lacked the power to implement them. In the business world, Theodore was accustomed to identifying problems and marshalling resources to address them, but he was beginning to understand that social problems operated according to different rules and constraints. The diner had grown even quieter, the trucker having departed, and the elderly man having folded his newspaper and shuffled toward the door. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall, and Theodore realized with a start that they had been talking for over an hour. Time had passed unnoticed, the way it did in conversations that mattered, that touched on something deeper than the usual social pleasantries. "I should let you get back to work," Theodore said, though he found himself reluctant to end their conversation. Something was happening here, some recognition of possibility that he hadn't felt in years. "But Sarah, I want you to know that your mother was one of the most remarkable people I ever had the privilege to know. She had a kind of moral courage that I've spent my whole life trying to understand." Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Theodore had seen from her all evening. "She said the same thing about you, you know. She used to tell me that you were the only rich person she ever met who remembered what it felt like to be poor. She said that was why you understood things that other people in your position couldn't understand." The observation stung because Theodore knew how far he had drifted from that understanding. The boy who had worn second-hand clothes and eaten government cheese had been buried beneath layers of success and privilege, insulated from struggle by walls of wealth that grew higher with each passing year. Elena had seen him more clearly than he saw himself, had recognized the disconnect between his origins and his current existence. "I'm not sure that's true anymore," Theodore said quietly. "I think your mother saw the person I used to be, or the person I could be, rather than the person I've become." The admission was painful but necessary, an acknowledgement that success without purpose was ultimately meaningless. Sarah studied his face with an intensity that reminded Theodore painfully of her mother's penetrating gaze. "Maybe," she said finally, "but Mom always said that people don't really change. They just sometimes forget who they are. She said you could choose to remember any time you wanted to." The words echoed in Theodore's mind long after Sarah had returned to her duties, long after he had paid his check and walked back to his car through the still falling rain. The drive home took him through neighborhoods he rarely visited, past apartment buildings and small houses that reminded him of his own childhood, past the invisible geography of struggle that existed parallel to his world of boardrooms and country clubs. By the time Theodore reached his penthouse apartment, he had made a decision that would have seemed impossible when he first walked into the diner hours earlier. He spent the rest of the night at his computer, researching social service organizations, reading about innovative approaches to poverty reduction, studying the kind of comprehensive programs that Sarah had described with such passion. What he found both inspired and appalled him: brilliant solutions implemented on shoestring budgets by dedicated professionals who were fighting systemic problems with inadequate resources. The next morning, Theodore did something he had not done in over a decade. He cleared his calendar and drove back to the diner. Sarah was working the morning shift, moving between tables with the same quiet efficiency he had observed the night before. When she saw him, surprise flickered across her features, followed by something that might have been hope. "Mr. Richardson, I didn't expect to see you again so soon." She approached his table with a coffee pot and the same professional demeanor, but Theodore could see curiosity in her eyes. "Sarah, I have a proposition for you," Theodore said without preamble. "I've spent the night researching the kind of work you described, and I think you're right about the need for comprehensive approaches to addressing poverty. I want to fund a pilot program, something that could serve as a model for other communities, and I want you to design and run it." Sarah set down the coffee pot with hands that trembled slightly. "Mr. Richardson, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity. My mother would never forgive me, and I would never forgive myself." "This isn't charity," Theodore said firmly. "This is a job offer, a partnership. I have money and connections, but I don't have your understanding of the problems we're trying to solve. I don't have your insights into what families like yours actually need. I need someone who can bridge the gap between resources and reality, someone who understands both the theory and the lived experience of poverty. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Theodore could see Sarah wrestling with pride and possibility, duty to her mother's memory, and responsibility to her own dreams. He had structured the proposal carefully, framing it not as rescue, but as recognition of Sarah's expertise and value. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah asked finally, her voice steady despite the emotion Theodore could see in her eyes. Over the next 2 hours, Theodore outlined a vision that had crystallized during his sleepless night of research. A comprehensive family support center that would provide not just emergency assistance, but long-term investment in human potential. Job training programs linked to actual employment opportunities. Educational support for children and adults. Financial literacy programs that acknowledged the complex realities of poverty rather than assuming simple lack of knowledge. Mental health services that understood the psychological toll of economic insecurity. Legal assistance to help families navigate systems designed to be navigated by people with resources and connections. The goal, Theodore explained, would be to create a replicable model that other communities could adapt to their own circumstances, something that addresses root causes rather than just symptoms, something that treats people as whole human beings rather than collections of problems to be solved. Sarah listened with growing excitement, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her deep understanding of the challenges they would face. She pushed back on some of Theodore's assumptions, refined others, added layers of complexity he had not considered. By the end of their conversation, Theodore realized that the program they were discussing was stronger and more sophisticated than anything he could have conceived alone. "There's one condition," Sarah said as their conversation drew to a close. "This can't be the Theodore Richardson charity project. If we're going to do this, it has to be a real collaboration. I won't be your poster child for good works, and I won't let you use this program to make yourself feel better about your wealth while keeping everything else in your life exactly the same." The challenge was fair and necessary, and Theodore found himself respecting Sarah even more for making it. She was demanding authenticity, insisting that any partnership between them be based on genuine commitment rather than noblesse oblige. "Agreed," Theodore said. "But I have a condition too. This program gets designed and implemented properly, with adequate resources and professional standards. We're not going to create another underfunded non-profit that burns out its staff and fails its clients. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Over the following months, Theodore found himself more energized than he had been in years. The work of creating the Pathways Family Center consumed his attention in ways that his usual business dealings no longer could. He discovered that applying his analytical skills to social problems was far more complex and rewarding than manipulating financial markets for profit. The process also forced Theodore to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems that had made his wealth possible. As he studied the structural factors that trapped families in poverty, he began to understand how his own investment strategies had sometimes contributed to those very problems. The cost-cutting measures that increased his returns often translated into job losses for working families. The real estate investments that generated passive income for his portfolio often displaced long-time residents from their communities. These realizations led to broader changes in Theodore's business practices. He began incorporating social impact criteria into his investment decisions, seeking opportunities that generated both financial returns and positive community outcomes. It was the approach that his advisors initially resisted, warning that such considerations would reduce his profits. But Theodore discovered that sustainable businesses serving real human needs often proved more resilient and profitable than enterprises focused solely on short-term gains. Sarah proved to be a remarkable partner in every sense. Her insights into the lived experience of poverty were matched by her ability to translate those insights into practical program design. She had a gift for building trust with clients who had been failed by other institutions, and her bilingual skills allowed the center to serve the growing Hispanic population in their community. Most importantly, she brought a perspective to their work that kept Theodore grounded in the human reality of the problems they were addressing. The Pathways Family Center officially opened 18 months after Theodore's chance encounter with Sarah in the roadside diner. The opening ceremony was attended by local politicians, social service professionals, and dozens of families who would be served by the new programs. Theodore gave brief remarks about the importance of comprehensive approaches to addressing poverty, but the real star of the event was Sarah, who spoke passionately about the center's mission and vision. "We believe that every family deserves not just survival, but the opportunity to thrive," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "We believe that poverty is not a personal failing, but a systemic challenge that requires systemic solutions. And we believe that when we invest in human potential, we create returns that can't be measured in dollars alone." As Theodore listened to Sarah speak, he found himself thinking about Elena Martinez and the conversation that had started this entire journey. Elena had been right about the person he could be, the person he had almost forgotten in his pursuit of ever greater success. Working with Sarah had reconnected him to that person, had reminded him that his greatest achievements would not be measured in the size of his portfolio, but in the lives he had helped to transform. In the months that followed, the Pathways Family Center exceeded even Theodore's optimistic projections. Families who had been trapped in cycles of crisis found stability and began building toward long-term goals. Children who had been falling behind in school caught up and began to excel. Parents who had been working multiple minimum wage jobs qualified for better positions that paid living wages and offered benefits. But perhaps more importantly, the center served as a model that other communities began to replicate. Theodore established the Pathways Foundation to support similar initiatives across the country, and Sarah became a sought-after consultant, helping other organizations develop comprehensive family support programs. The success of their partnership also transformed Theodore's understanding of wealth and responsibility. He began to see his resources not as rewards for his personal excellence, but as tools that could be deployed to create opportunity for others. He established scholarship programs for first-generation college students, invested in small businesses in underserved communities, and supported policy initiatives aimed at addressing systemic inequality. Sarah, meanwhile, had found her calling in work that utilized both her professional training and her personal experience. She completed her master's degree in social work through a program Theodore funded, and she began speaking at conferences and universities about innovative approaches to poverty reduction. Her insights, grounded in both theory and lived experience, influenced a new generation of social workers and policymakers. 3 years after their first meeting in the diner, Theodore and Sarah were invited to testify before a congressional committee studying federal poverty programs. Their presentation focused on the Pathways model and its potential for national replication, but their testimony went beyond program specifics to address fundamental questions about how society should respond to economic inequality. "The choice we face," Sarah told the assembled legislators, "is whether we want to manage poverty or eliminate it. Managing poverty is cheaper in the short term, but eliminating it is more cost-effective in the long run, both financially and morally. The Pathways model demonstrates that when we invest comprehensively in families, we get comprehensive returns: reduced crime, improved health outcomes, increased educational achievement, and stronger communities. Theodore followed Sarah's testimony with a presentation about the economic benefits of addressing poverty proactively rather than reactively. He had commissioned several studies demonstrating that comprehensive family support programs generated positive returns on investment within 5 years, primarily through reduced need for emergency services and increased tax revenues from families who achieved economic stability. From a purely business perspective, Theodore told the committee, investing in human potential is one of the smartest investments we can make. But the business case, compelling as it is, isn't the most important argument. The most important argument is that we have the resources and knowledge to dramatically reduce poverty in this country, and our failure to do so represents a moral failure, not an economic necessity. Their testimony received significant media attention and helped generate support for legislation expanding federal funding for comprehensive family support programs. More importantly, it established Sarah as a national voice on poverty policy and positioned the Pathways model as a viable alternative to traditional approaches to social services. As their professional partnership deepened, Theodore and Sarah also developed a personal friendship that enriched both their lives. Theodore discovered that Sarah shared her mother's gift for seeing past surface appearances to underlying character, and her insights helped him navigate not just their collaborative work, but his broader life decisions. Sarah, meanwhile, found in Theodore a mentor and advocate who understood both the world she came from and the world she was working to change. His support allowed her to take risks and pursue ambitious goals that would have been impossible without adequate resources and connections. Their friendship also helped Theodore process the grief he had never fully acknowledged over Elena's death and his own failure to maintain closer connections with the people who had shaped his character. Sarah shared stories about her mother's later years, about the pride Elena had taken in her daughter's achievements and the hope she had maintained even during her final illness. "She never stopped believing in people," Sarah told Theodore during one of their regular lunch meetings. "Even when people disappointed her, even when systems failed her, she never stopped believing that most people wanted to do the right thing if they just had the opportunity and support to do it. That belief sustained her through everything, and it's what drives my work now." Elena's faith in human possibility had been vindicated in ways she never could have imagined. Her influence had extended far beyond her own family to touch the lives of thousands of people who benefited from the programs her daughter and Theodore created together. Her legacy lived on in every family that found stability through the Pathways Center, in every child who stayed in school because comprehensive support services addressed the root causes of their academic struggles, in every parent who gained the skills and confidence to break cycles of poverty. 5 years after their chance encounter in the roadside diner, Theodore and Sarah stood together at the groundbreaking ceremony for the 10th Pathways Family Center. The program had evolved and expanded beyond anything they had originally envisioned, serving as a model for communities across the United States and attracting international attention from policymakers studying American approaches to poverty reduction. As Theodore watched Sarah address the crowd of supporters, community members, and families who would be served by the new center, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The restless dissatisfaction that had driven him to take that impulsive drive 5 years earlier had been replaced by a sense of purpose that infused every aspect of his life. He had found his way back to the values that Elena Martinez had recognized in him decades earlier, the values that his mother Margaret had instilled in him during those formative years in Pittsburgh. The boy who had promised his mother that he would make something of himself had finally understood that making something of yourself meant more than accumulating wealth or achieving recognition. It meant using whatever gifts and advantages you possessed to create opportunities for others, to build bridges across the chasms that divided communities, to invest in human potential wherever you found it. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached Theodore with tears in her eyes. "I wish my mother could see this," she said quietly. "She would be so proud of what we've built together, but more than that, she would be proud that you remembered who you really are." Theodore nodded, understanding that Elena was present in ways that transcended physical absence. Her influence lived on in her daughter's passion for justice, in the comprehensive approach to addressing poverty that honored the dignity and potential of every family, in the recognition that wealth without compassion was ultimately empty. "She can see it," Theodore replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "And she knows that none of this would have been possible without her example, without her courage to raise a daughter who would challenge me to be better than I thought I could be." As they walked toward their cars, Theodore realized that the chance encounter in the roadside diner had not been chance at all, but destiny finally asserting itself after years of delay. Elena Martinez had set in motion a chain of events that had taken decades to fully unfold, but her faith in human potential had ultimately been vindicated in ways that honored both her memory and the promise of the future they were building together. The rain that had brought Theodore to the diner that night 5 years earlier had washed away more than the dust of the highway. It had washed away the barriers between who he had been and who he was meant to become. In finding Sarah, he had found his way back to himself, and in partnership with her, he had discovered that true success was measured not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away, not in the heights you reached alone, but in how many others you lifted up alongside you. Elena Martinez had spoken truly. It was never too late to remember who you really were, and sometimes it took the voice of the next generation to call you back to your better angels. In Sarah's courage and compassion, Theodore had found not just a business partner, but a path back to the values that mattered most. A reminder that the most important investments were always investments in human potential, in the belief that every person deserved the chance to write their own story of transformation and hope.